that's what they're also defunding. And they're saying to Republicans, just give up. Just don't fund our customs professionals. Just don't fund the ICE professionals. Just don't fund them. We don't plan on ever paying them, so they'll quit. I think that's a terrible idea. Because help me understand the moment when we get back together and then my Democratic colleagues suddenly say, we've changed our mind, now we want to fund ICE. It's not going to happen. I saw during the Biden administration up close and personal. They do not want to fund border protection. I saw it. The American people do want to have sane border policy. We do want to have sane enforcement. Now, just to do a little history in here, 13 days ago, the White House sent over a proposal, and it wasn't just a secret. The President of the United States posted on social media and made it very clear. These are the things that he is willing to be able to make the change on that Democrats have asked for, and now 2 weeks later, they're still saying, we're thinking about it. Why? Because it's good politics to say, we're still thinking about it. What are the things that they actually asked for, that the president came out and made a public social media post saying these are the things that we will do? He came out immediately and said, we will do a full investigation of the 2 American citizens that died. Full public investigation of that. Made that very clear. Pulled out of a surge that had happened in Minnesota. The president said under good faith, we're going to pull out entirely from that. The president then said, we're going to do body-worn cameras, make sure that they're all required. That's what Democrats were asking for. The president's already agreed to on that. Has already sent a dollar amount over with the requirement on that. The president already came out and publicly made a statement where Democrats said, we want identification on every federal agent. The president came out and said, I will agree to putting identification on every single agent. That's all been agreed to. There was also a statement made by Democrats that they would not, ICE agents would not go into what they call, quote unquote, sensitive sites to do arrest. The president already came out and said, we're not going to go into sensitive sites except for one. One of the demands that was made was ICE could not go into a polling place. Of all things, help me understand why someone illegally present should be in a polling place. But Democrats demanded that ICE agents not go into polling places, which, by the way, is why we want to bring the Save America Act up next week. The president said, no, I won't agree on a polling place because someone not legally present shouldn't be there in the first place. The president came out and said, I will agree to de-escalation training. All those things have already been agreed to 13 days ago. 13 days ago. And now because of good politics, the White House just has to sit and wait, I guess, and TSA agents get paid when they feel like it. And in the meantime, the strategy to try to just not pay ICE agents indefinitely until they quit continues to linger. So no, let's fund DHS. There's lots of agreements that the White House has already announced publicly that they want to do on this. They've been sending paperwork over. They've been sending legislative language over. And so far, it has been silence. So let's actually solve this problem. This is a room full of grown-ups. Let's have the grown-up conversation, whether it's on this floor or off this floor. But the last thing that we should do is leave this place and not have this thing resolved. Last Thursday, I was on this same floor at this same desk saying, why are we leaving town without this being resolved? All of our DHS professionals are not getting paid, and everybody's just going home like the situation's the same. It's not the same. Let's stay here until we actually get it worked out. But instead, just walked away as if nothing was happening. So let's stay here until we work it out. That would be the right thing to do for all of those families, regardless of what they are, regardless of what their task is. Even the federal agents that are actually right now not being paid or on furlough that are working on child trafficking, even those folks, which the current proposal from my Democratic colleagues are saying we will fund everything but them. I think we should be paying the folks that are actually going after child trafficking. I think we should be paying the people that are going after drug smuggling. I think we should be paying all the folks in HSI. I think we should. So let's do that. I yield the floor, and then let's solve the problem.
The senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, we would like that opportunity to continue funding the Department of Homeland Security in its entirety while we have a conversation about the best pathway to move forward. So I have two asks of my Democratic colleagues. We said this last week, you agreed, let's try it again. Let's sit down and figure out what is that pathway forward. We can't move the needle on anything without having a conversation. So let's do it. And let's fund this important agency whose job it is to keep Americans safe. Look, we do really important work in every one of our states, whether it's the Coast Guard, TSA, Secret Service, CBP, ICE, FEMA, and more. It's incumbent upon each and every one of us to figure out a pathway forward. We've heard more from our Democratic colleagues today on the floor than we have heard in the last 48 days. The last offer went back over to Democrats 13 days ago. 13 days ago. In that interim time period, we have asked to get together with Democrats, Republicans in the White House to talk about what is a pathway forward. Not only have we not received anything back, we also have not had that opportunity. Look, the people who sent us here expect more. They expect us to have tough conversations. They expect us to figure out a pathway forward. And that's exactly what we're trying to do today. We want to fund the Department of Homeland Security. Republicans are offering a 2-week continuing resolution to do just that. Notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of my bill, which is at the desk, a bill to be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to be reconsidered, made and laid upon the table.
What can the senator state the bill number?
Yes. Let's see. Mr. President, while we wait on that bill number, I want to say this, guys, don't change the rules of the game. I mean, the Senate is supposed to function in a meaningful way to do the work for the people that we serve. Coming out here and wanting to carve this or that without ever sitting down with your colleagues on the other side to talk about a pathway forward or to even talk about this plan is disingenuous. And it's starting a new norm. I can already see when you all are back in charge, the number of things that this side doesn't want to fund or talk about. And if this is the approach that we took, you would say we were breaking the Senate. So I ask you today to allow us to continue all of these people getting a paycheck. Everyone in the department, everyone has to meet their bills. They have to make their payments. They have mortgages. They have childcare. They have wives' cancer treatment. All of these people do. So we are saying in good faith, let's pay all the members of the Department of Homeland Security while we find a pathway forward. Bill number, calendar number 156, HR 4553.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. As I have made clear to all of my colleagues on both sides, Democrats are happy to pass funding for most DHS agencies, TSA, FEMA, CISA, and more, while we work on accountability for ICE and Border Patrol. I just tried to pass that bill. What we are not willing to do is to pass a bill with more funding for ICE and Border Patrol and no reforms. To pass a bill for ICE and Border Patrol with 0 new reforms. This is pretty simple. We cannot have masked thugs kidnapping American citizens, no badge or identification, no warrant, nothing. We cannot have peaceful protesters and legal observers getting tackled and tear gassed and even shot and killed by federal agents. We cannot just ignore the Trump administration slandering American citizens as terrorists and lying shamelessly to cover up its own abuses. We have got to have accountability. We've got to. Americans' rights are at stake. And as we have seen, their lives are at stake. This bill from Republicans, which is essentially unchanged from the last time rejected it, doesn't do enough to meet this moment, not by a long shot. But look, if the senator wants to work with me on a short-term CR to fund TSA and FEMA and the other important agencies without providing more money at this time for ICE and Border Patrol, I am ready. I'm willing to get that done today. So I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The senator from Alabama.
look, we stand ready, and I am disappointed that we've objected to being able to fund the Department of Homeland Security that we just saw my colleague from Washington object to. The proposal that they are offering does this. Our proposal today that we just put on the floor was $100 million for drug interdictions. The proposal that they put on the floor today was 0. When you're looking at the proposal that they just objected to here on this floor, we had $2.5 million for the Center for Countering Human Trafficking at HSI. Their proposal that they put on the floor today, 0. The proposal that we put on the floor that they just objected to, Mr. President, $2.1 million for increase inspections for ICE detention centers. And they just objected to it. The proposal that they put on the floor, 0. The proposal that the Democrats just objected to, moving forward to fund, we just asked to fund TSA. We just asked to fund the Coast Guard. We just asked to fund Secret Service. We just asked to fund FEMA. We just asked to fund CBP, ICE, and our proposal had $7 million for investigations of child exploitations and forced labor at HSI. Mr. President, do you know how much was in the Democratic proposal that they put on the floor today? 0. We're not going to turn our back on law enforcement. We're not going to turn our back on border security. We will not go backwards back to defund the police. We will not go backwards to the failed border policies of the Biden administration. We're not doing it. Fentanyl and drug overdoses are down over 24% year over year. We will not back away from that. What we will do, and we hope happens, is that you will sit down with us to have a conversation on a pathway forward. But in that interim, you cannot hold these people hostage. There are good people who are working hard at ports of entry and at HSI and all throughout the Department of Homeland Security that deserve a paycheck. Why are you playing politics with people's lives? Let's talk about a pathway forward. Let's talk about what we do. But grandstanding and political posturing is not the answer, Mr. President. And I am disappointed that my Democratic colleagues just blocked funding for TSA. They just blocked funding for FEMA. Why? I do not know. But I am hopeful they'll come to the table so that we can find a pathway forward. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, we did put forward a proposal to fund TSA, to fund FEMA, to fund CISA, to move forward on so much of what the American people know needs to move forward on. We're not negotiating in a vacuum here. We are in a different world than we were when these negotiations began a few weeks ago, as we are now finding our country in a war with Iran. We're seeing American service members in harm's way. We see this president recklessly pushing on and not caring at all about how many billions of dollars that he is spending each and every day in prosecuting this war, without the kind of thinking of what is needed to be able to protect our service members, Americans in harm's way, our diplomatic posts. So we are trying to come up with solutions here, understanding the challenges that we're facing. These are not normal times. This is not the same world. And what we tried to do is come forward here focused on a pragmatic, realistic approach on what it is that we can agree upon. It is what every family has to deal with in terms of understanding how to be able to come up with solutions that move forward, especially in these dangerous times. And we know that Americans have these concerns. When I think about CISA, when I think about the cybersecurity work, I used to work in national security, in Afghanistan, on Iraq, and so many other challenges in counterterrorism. We need that now more than ever. And I'll be honest with you, the fact that this president moved forward with this war without us being able to have a fully functioning CISA, not just because of the budget, but because they cut so much of the staff over this last year. These are reckless actions. And that is why we need to be able to have this type of debate, but we are doing this in a context of war. So we move forward, try to have the funding be able to move forward in that way on what we can agree on while we are still continuing on. Because as there has been recognition on both sides today, we are still far off when it comes to ICE, when it comes to the lawlessness that we see, and we seek the accountability on behalf of the American people. I hear this each and every day. Just yesterday, I was in a meeting with ICE officials, because they are trying to impose upon a town of Roxbury this warehouse detention facility. This, by the way, is a town that voted for Trump, is Republican leadership, but they stand unified with me and many others, saying that ICE never even talked to them, never even consulted them, whether or not this was even logistically possible, let alone something that the community wants. When I asked the ICE officials yesterday, are they aware that there are residential buildings right around this, that maybe people don't want their backyard to be a huge, massive detention site? ICE didn't care. They didn't even bother to ask what the local community. That's what we're seeing, not just in Roxbury, but all over this country. The lack of accountability. They just could not care less what the people in Roxbury believed. And that is what we are trying to stand up for. And I promised that community, again, a community that voted for Trump, Republican leadership, that I will do everything that I can to be able to restore that sense of accountability and restore that sense of movement forward. They do not want a single dollar to go to this warehouse, and I don't want a single dollar to go to ICE as we continue to see the lack of reforms push forward. And I understand the concerns and the challenges that are out there. I worked as a career public servant, an officer at the State Department, worked under multiple shutdowns, worked under multiple presidents of both parties. I don't want to see this go on one day longer than it needs to. But I also know that our servicemen and women, they are dedicated public servants, and we need to show them that we are being pragmatic and realistic, that we are moving the needle forward, trying to address it. And that's what the proposal put forward by Senator Murray today was about, an effort to be able to move forward, try to focus in on where we have disagreement while not holding back on where we have agreement to be able to protect the American people. And with that, I yield back.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I just want to pick up where my colleague from New Jersey left off, which is the proposal that was put forward by the senator from Washington, Senator Murray, which is to have a vote today to make sure that we fully fund TSA, that we fully fund FEMA, and that we fully fund the Coast Guard. I've heard a couple times just on this floor from our Republican colleagues that Democrats are blocking funding for TSA and FEMA and the Coast Guard. That simply isn't true. In fact, I'm looking at a post. I heard a couple mentions of politics as part of this conversation. Just a few days ago, the Senate Republican Post said Democrats are forcing 100,000 plus federal employees to work without pay. Well, this wasn't true then, because just last week, Senator Murray also proposed that we fully fund TSA and FEMA and the Coast Guard. It wasn't true when they posted it, and it's not true today. In fact, what we're doing today is giving our Republican colleagues another chance to actually pay these federal employees. Now, I don't think anybody is confused about what's happening here. And that is that the American people understand that Trump's ICE operation is out of control. It is violating the constitutional due process of people throughout the country. It is violating the First Amendment rights of people throughout the country, including the right to peacefully protest. We all recall, like it was yesterday, the fact that DHS agents shot and killed 2 American citizens in Minneapolis, Renee Good, and Alex Preddy. And then the Secretary of Homeland Security, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, turned around and called them domestic terrorists, called the victims of those shootings domestic terrorists. And from the very start, the Trump administration has lied to the American people about the targets of the ICE operation. And I heard it again on the floor of the Senate here today. They said they were going to go after the worst of the worst, people who are here illegally and posed a threat to public safety in our communities. That would have been acceptable, but that is not what they're doing in the overwhelming number of these cases. In Maryland, they swept up a pastor from the Eastern Shore. They arrested and then deported a small businesswoman from Hagerstown. She'd been here 20 years, Vietnamese American woman, beloved in her community, had a nail salon business. And the list goes on and on and on. In fact, Republicans are beginning to recognize that this is completely unpopular with the American people. Yesterday, here are 2 headlines. One is in the Washington Post. White House tells House GOP to avoid mass deportation talk ahead of midterms. Here's another headline. Axios, White House tells House Republicans to stop talking about mass deportations. Well, they want Republicans to stop talking about mass deportations, but they're not actually doing anything to stop mass deportations. And what Democrats have said is we want meaningful changes at ICE before we provide any additional funding. I've been clear, I won't support one more penny for Trump's lawless ICE operation. And yet, we're not getting any meaningful response from the White House with respect to the necessary reforms. And so that's why we have said, let's not hold hostage TSA. Let's not hold hostage FEMA. Let's not hold hostage the Coast Guard. Let's make sure they can continue to operate. Let's make sure that those federal employees can get paid for the work that they're doing. I mean, I'm looking again at this post, the social media post that Republican senators put out, Senate Republicans. It's got all these headlines from around the country. Partial government shutdown, spring break travel leads to hours-long TSA lines at Hobby Airport. And they go on and on. We're saying we can end this. We could end it today. But Republicans are blocking. I just want to close with this point, and it's been made by Senator from Washington, Senator Murray, and others. When Republicans passed what they call their big, beautiful bill, which was beautiful if you're a billionaire because you got big tax cuts. They cut Medicaid, they cut other health programs, cut food programs. But as part of that bill, they increased the ICE budget by over 7 times its annual amount. And they increased the Customs and Border Patrol budget by about double its annual amount. So that's why, as we speak, ICE agents are being paid. As we speak, Customs and Border Patrol agents are being paid out of those accounts. You know who's not being paid? TSA. You know who's not being paid? FEMA. You know who's not being paid? Coast Guard. Do you know what the Democratic proposal would do that's offered by Senator Murray? Pay all those people so they can do the work that they need to do on behalf of the American people and get paid for the good work that they do. That's what our proposal does. It does what Senate Republicans claim on their social media posts that they want to do, that they want to pay these 100,000 federal employees. But today, through their votes and their actions, they're actually saying the opposite. They're saying they want to continue to deny funding for those particular agencies because we won't give ICE and its lawless operations a blank check. And we're not going to give ICE a blank check. The American people don't want us to give a blank check to ICE. But for goodness sakes, let's not penalize folks at TSA and FEMA and the Coast Guard, and let's not penalize the American people by hampering those agencies and preventing them from fully doing their good work on behalf of the country. I yield the floor.
Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. These times are not normal. In normal times, in the history of the United States of America, government agents bashing down doors, trashing living rooms, terrorizing children, detaining and arresting people without a judicial warrant would be condemned by the administration, and they would say, we need reforms. In normal times, masked agents in unmarked cars without identification on their bodies would be forbidden by the government of the United States of America. In normal times, mass sweeps in the streets or shootings of United States citizens for no reason, citizens without any criminal record, and killing 2 of them, would prompt sweeping reforms by that administration. And in normal times, the government of the United States would say, when we are responsible for harms that violate people's rights and injure them, they should have recourse. They should have redress. In normal times, that's what would happen. These times are not normal because this administration has no respect for the law. It is not only condoning, it's encouraging an out-of-control, lawless, and reckless agency, ICE, and also the Customs and Border Patrol, which is operating unlawfully as a matter of clear statute outside where it should be just geographically. And in normal times, we would value public servants at TSA, in the Coast Guard, in FEMA, rather than having a Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, causing cuts, massive firings, cancellations of contracts that devalue and demean and degrade those public servants. The failure to pay them now reflects that demeaning and degrading attitude toward public servants, because this administration has the money to provide those payments. And it has done in the past, moving funds from one account to another in ways that are perfectly possible now, but the measures that we have before us would compel them to pay those public servants. These times are not normal, and that's why we stand here today. to insist that the Constitution of the United States be respected. 250 years ago, colonies revolted because British soldiers bashed down doors and took stuff from the colonial settlers. And America revolted. It took years, long years, winter fighting. George Washington rallying the troops, continuing to recruit and keep them going along with others, a fraction of the population at that point enduring suffering and pain far more painful than standing in line at an airport. But the values and the laws that we are here to defend are what should be normal in America. They are what is normal in our Constitution and our respect for individual rights and liberties. And we are in the minority in this body as well as in the other house. We're in the minority in the Congress. We have no one in the White House. The Supreme Court is controlled by the majority party. The power of the purse is one of the levers that we do have. And we are using that power to say no to DHS funding as long as these kinds of violations of laws are occurring and reoccurring, not only in Minneapolis, but all across the country. And the hearings that I held in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, the spotlight hearings with people, United States citizens who have been dragged out of their cars and assaulted, forced to the pavement, injured, denied medical care, access to phones or lawyers or their families. The hearings that we had with a whistleblower who told us that that kind of misconduct was no accident. It was the result of instructions and training specifically given to those agents to violate the Fourth Amendment. And of course, the brothers of Renee Good, who was killed, telling us how it happened. America is demanding these reforms. It isn't we who are imagining or hypothesizing the need for them. America is demanding them after America has seen what ICE and CBP are doing. And we can enable payment of TSA and FEMA and the Coast Guard and those brave and dedicated public servants in those agencies by simply approving today the measure that the senator from Washington has so ably brought to us. Common sense reforms are not incompatible with the payment of these individuals. Let us pay them now, adopt this measure, and then make sure that we keep faith with America, that we adhere to the rule of law, that we apply the same standards of conduct to federal agents as apply to local police in your community. If your police chief took the position that this administration has done, they would be fired. If they defended local police who bashed down doors without a judicial warrant at homes without consent, if they defended masked members of their local police force doing sweeps with masks, without identification, and unmarked cars, they would be fired. And if they opposed the idea that people who were harmed in violation of the law by local police should have no recourse, they would be fired. So I hope my Republican colleagues will get serious about what should be normal, and that they will decide what to do, what is best for their constituents. and for American. We're ready. We have been ready. We're simply asking that ICE and CBP follow the rule of law and adhere to the same standards as local and state police forces, and that our Republican colleagues get serious about paying the dedicated men and women of these agencies who are working hard every day and deserve our respect. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, thank you. I've been here hearing my colleagues discuss this matter, and I think I want to just try to separate out the political rhetoric and maybe also puncture some of the Senate speak we use to talk about the kinds of bills we're considering, and talk about an elemental rule of negotiation that I think most of us learned pretty early, which is when you can find agreement, go for it. Do it. And on the areas where you disagree, keep talking. Go for it when you agree, and in areas of disagreement, keep talking. If you've listened to this debate today, what you've heard is there's huge areas of agreement on this floor. There is a sharp area of disagreement. We can act on the agreement, and we should. Everyone on this floor, I believe, certainly those who have been here talking today, and I think the overwhelming majority, we have agreed that TSA should be funded. We have agreed that the Coast Guard should be funded. We have agreed that FEMA should be funded. We've agreed that the CISA cybersecurity agency should be funded. And I think I'm right about this to my colleague from Washington. We've not only agreed that it should be funded, we've written the bills, exactly the line items, bipartisan agreement in both houses. We've put reforms into those bills that both sides agree with, and those bills are ready to be acted on and give the employees of those agencies and the citizens who rely on them certainty that they're funded through the end of the year. So why wouldn't we do that? That's what Senator Murray's proposal is. We've reached agreement, let's do it. Senator Britt offered a different proposal in those areas of agreement. Let's just fund them for 2 weeks. And not with the agreed upon structure and the reforms and the line item amounts. When somebody says they want to do a continuing resolution, for those who aren't familiar with that Senate term, what it means is instead of the negotiation we did about how to fund these agencies, we'll just do for the next 2 weeks what we were doing for the last 2 weeks. I call that driving by looking in the rearview mirror rather than driving by looking in the windshield. We should want to drive by looking in the windshield, not the rearview mirror. And we have the bills all done. Imagine you're at TSA. Are you going to feel better knowing that the Senate decided to fund you for 2 weeks, or the Senate decided to fund you for the entire rest of the year? How about if you're a coastie and you're on a ship doing interdiction in the Caribbean? Do you feel better if it's a 2-week deal, or we're going to fund you for the rest of the year? If you're at FEMA doing emergency, we're going to fund you for the rest of the year. The proposal that Senator Murray has offered is far preferable for all of the employees in these agencies where we have reached agreement than a deal that just says, well, we'll fund you for the next 2 weeks, and then who knows what will happen after that. So since we have found agreement, meaningful, substantive, bipartisan, bicameral agreement on every line item and every detail and on every reform affecting all of these really important agencies, why wouldn't we move forward on it? I just don't understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would want to do 2 weeks of funding when we could do the full year funding for these agencies. The area of disagreement is obvious. It's the area of immigration reform as performed by ICE and CBP. Now, I heard one of my colleagues, the senator from Oklahoma, says the goal of us is to defund it till everybody quits. That is a hyperbole that's not true. I've been here for 13 years. I voted for so much funding for DHS and so much funding for CBP and ICE. But now the American public, and we all, to one degree or another, know there just have to be reforms. We're not going to give a blank check. We are demanding reforms. To my colleagues who are here with me, we had a budget hearing yesterday, and the budget hearing was about immigration enforcement. And the Republicans had as a witness one of Virginia's sheriffs, Sheriff of Loudoun County, Sheriff Chapman. And he was there to talk about immigration enforcement. Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. I pointed out, I've dealt with them a lot over the years. When I go to the Halloween parade and other things in Leesburg, if you're not doing anything on Halloween, go to Leesburg and go to the Halloween parade. It's fantastic. And when you see Loudoun County Sheriff's deputies, they don't wear masks. They wear uniforms that identify they work for the Loudoun County Sheriff. They wear name tags. They use body cameras. You know, if the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department can uphold basic standards of law enforcement professionalism, why is it unreasonable for the American public? Why is it unreasonable for Democratic senators to ask the same thing of federal law enforcement agents who work at ICE and CBP? These are common sense reforms, but we haven't yet found Republicans willing to agree on them. Okay, that means we still have work to do. Let's do that work. But let's give full year funding to all these other agencies where we have found agreement. Not 2-week funding, not just, we'll kick it down the road for 2 weeks and then you got to worry in the next 2 weeks whether you're going to have a paycheck. Full year funding for all the agencies except where we're having this most important debate. Elementary rule of negotiation: when you can find agreement, go for it. And on areas where you can't, keep talking. That's what the Murray proposal is, and that's why I so strongly support it. I yield, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I have to say it is extremely frustrating to me that despite all their talk about how important it is we do fund TSA and FEMA and CISA and more, and despite Republicans' own acknowledgement that they already funded ICE and Border Patrol with their big reconciliation, I call it the big ugly bill from last summer, now Republicans are unwilling to work with us to fund some of these programs that keep Americans safe, while we keep trying to get somewhere on ICE and Border Patrol accountability. And worse than that, Mr. President, they're acting like they have no idea why Democrats are not willing to accept the premise that to fund TSA, we have to cut some blank check for ICE. Republicans are acting like they didn't see the same awful footage of Renee Good and Alex Preddy getting shot in cold blood. Republicans are acting like they don't remember that little boy in the bunny hat who was arrested like a violent criminal. Republicans are acting like they don't remember the family that got tear gassed on the way back from a basketball game, or the American citizen that was marched out of his house in the freezing cold in his underwear. As a reminder, because apparently Republicans need it, the Senate has had at least 2 hearings on this since Alex Preddy was murdered by CBP officers. And with a couple of exceptions, we have not heard any Republicans in those hearings suggest they want to work with us on reforming the agencies and reining in DHS. And yet some Republicans are acting like they have no idea now why we are demanding things like body cameras, visible identification, adequate training standards, and basic standards, as the senator just spoke about. Local police, same as our local police on things like use of force and requiring warrants before some agent smashes in your door and drags someone away. Republicans know exactly what Democrats have been asking for, because weeks ago, Democrats provided Speaker Johnson and Leader Thune a list of 10 critical reforms that we needed to pass the Homeland Security bill. Unfortunately, Republicans have been saying no on many of these items, as far back as last year, or in some cases, first they'd say, sure, we'll work with you, and then Stephen Miller in the White House would get involved and Republicans would say, never mind. Now, last year, Democrats were already talking about many of these reforms that we are now talking about today. In July, some of us introduced a bill calling for no masks and for clear identification. And then we saw federal agents shoot citizens and lie about it, like in the case of Miramar Martinez. And we heard horror stories of masked agents dragging away American citizens for no reason. One American citizen was dragged off and detained twice, not charged with any crime, not arrested with a warrant, just picked off his work site until ICE realized he was a citizen. That happened twice to the same guy. That's exactly why Democrats have been saying, let's take off the masks. We cannot have unaccountable agents. Republicans said no to that idea. And then the world watched as Renee Good was shot and killed by an ICE agent and denied any medical care, something even the most basic training, to say nothing of morals, should have told officers was wrong. So Democrats pushed in our DHS funding negotiations. We said, this is exactly the kind of thing we are gravely concerned about. We need serious reforms and accountability. Still, Republicans said no. Then an innocent man, an American citizen, was dragged out of his home in the freezing cold in his underwear, and agents refused to even look at his ID, which showed they had completely the wrong guy. And yet, when Democrats pushed to require real judicial warrants, Republicans said no. A little boy in bunny ears was ripped away from his home for absolutely no reason. Republicans said no. A family on their way home from a basketball game was tear gassed. Republicans said no. A woman on the way to a doctor's appointment had her window smashed. She was dragged out of her car. Republicans said no. And Alex Preddy, tackled to the ground, shot in the back several times by federal agents, another completely unjustified killing, a murder of an American citizen. And the Trump administration tried to slander him as a terrorist. For a moment, even some Republicans said that was concerning, that was unacceptable, that was wrong. But we all know what ultimately happened. Republicans have for weeks now refused some pretty basic steps to make these agencies accountable. And once again, Republicans said no. Well, Mr. President, the American people are not going to take no for an answer. Stephen Miller is not above the Constitution. Donald Trump is not a king who can just sic an army of masked thugs on whatever city he wants to punish next. And Democrats are not going to write a blank check for rogue agencies that are trampling on the rights of Americans. Nor are we going to accept the premise that the only way to fund TSA or disaster relief is by giving money to ICE. That's absurd. Now, some on the other side are claiming the bill I just offered would defund customs or Homeland Security investigations. Mr. President, that is also absurd. All the bill I just offered does is fund the rest of DHS while talks continue on ICE and Border Patrol. And the simple fact is, Republicans have already funded those agencies when they gave them more money than most militaries, by the way, in their big, ugly bill. And Republicans' latest tactic, trying to use a war as leverage against accountability for Americans, that's just plain wrong. It is cynical and it is utterly transparent. We are not going to give Trump a pass on citizens getting shot and killed here in America just because he single-handedly chose to start a war that has led to Americans being killed across the globe as well. Who in the world thought that argument would fly? Did Stephen Miller tell Republicans 2 wrongs make a right here? Did you think that was going to convince anybody? Look, we're going to hold Trump accountable for his reckless war, and we're going to hold him accountable for using ICE to terrorize American citizens. For the rest of DHS, does that important work to keep Americans feel safe, like FEMA, Coast Guard, TSA? Democrats are here. We are trying to fund those agencies while ICE and Border Patrol negotiations continue. But Republicans will neither agree to the reforms we need to rein in ICE and protect Americans, nor fund the rest of DHS while those talks continue. Now, here's the simple truth. If Republicans agree to simple reforms, all of DHS could be funded tomorrow. And if Republicans stop blocking the bill that I just offered, TSA could be funded today. But Republicans don't want to take serious action to prevent rogue government agencies from gunning down American citizens. We just heard that on the floor from several Republican senators who spoke. They don't want to take new steps to make sure masked federal agents don't kidnap people off our streets. They don't want to pass legislation to make sure federal agents only target people who have a judicial warrant instead of breaking down windows and dragging away completely innocent people. That is the crux of the problem right now. So let me state that again. The problem right now is not lack of communication between both the sides. That is absurd. The problem is a lack of willingness on the part of Republicans to pass some pretty basic reforms or to even fund the rest of DHS while those talks continue. Republicans don't want to protect Americans from rogue ICE agents. You know how I know that? Just listen to what they've said and what they didn't say right here on the floor. Are Republicans talking about the fact that American citizens have been gunned down by our ICE and patrol? Are Republicans talking about the fact that peaceful protesters are being tear gassed or pepper sprayed or tackled to the ground? Not a word on that right here. If Republicans cannot talk about the obvious, cannot talk about the blatant abuse we have all seen from ICE and Border Patrol, how do they expect to work with us to address that? The answer is they don't. Instead, they are pretending this is about FEMA, which I have offered to fund, or TSA, which I have offered to fund, or CISA, which I have offered to fund. And they are pretending this is about ICE funds running low, even after Republicans spent weeks acknowledging the agency has plenty of funding left from their big, ugly bill. What this debate actually is about, Mr. President, is accountability. It is long past time that Republicans get serious about that. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of keeping Wisconsin families safe. Keeping the people we work for safe is one of the most basic and solemn duties that we have. We are here to keep folks safe from natural disasters, dangerous drugs, and dangerous people. And that is what I am here to do today, because we need to fund critical agencies like TSA and FEMA and the U.S. Coast Guard to stop potential terror attacks and be sure that we are prepared for the next storm that hits an American community. I am also here to protect Wisconsinites from ICE terrorizing their communities like we saw in our neighboring state in the city of Minneapolis. We can and must do both. The people I work for are demanding it. We need to fund these agencies and put up common sense guardrails on ICE and Border Patrol. It's not an either or situation, as my Republican colleagues would have folks believe. We can ensure that TSA agents are paid and stop masked federal agents from causing chaos in our residential neighborhoods. We can prevent cybersecurity attacks from our adversaries and ensure ICE and Border Patrol don't gun down more U.S. citizens in our streets. We can make sure communities reeling from disaster get the federal support they need and hold federal agents to the same basic standards that our local police officers operate under on a day-to-day basis. Protecting Americans means doing both. If Republicans are serious about funding the Department of Homeland Security, the path forward is simple. Let's pass this bill today. Let's keep these crucial agencies open while we come together to negotiate common sense reforms so ICE stops killing Americans in our streets. I've been clear that I will not support another blank check to ICE without reasonable guardrails that stop the chaos, violence, and death that we've seen in cities like Minneapolis. Now, my Republican colleagues are trying to use Donald Trump's illegal war in Iran to get us to back down on these demands. Democrats know how dangerous President Trump's war of choice in Iran is, and that's why I'm against it. There's no denying Americans are less safe today than they were before President Trump took us to war. And I'm glad my Republican colleagues are willing to admit it. But if they think Americans will just forget watching the gut-wrenching videos of ICE officers taking the lives of innocent American citizens, they have another thing coming. The American people aren't buying it. They expect our government to stop terror threats and respond to natural disasters, not to intimidate and kill innocent people. I'm not giving up on my commitment to protecting Americans from Donald Trump's out-of-control agencies that have killed US citizens, terrorized communities, and caused chaos in our streets. I, for one, am willing to compromise. I'm ready to fund the Department of Homeland Security without ICE. This straightforward plan funds key agencies while giving my Republican colleagues more time to come to the table on common sense reforms that Americans overwhelmingly support. Mr. President, I yield.
Appreciate it.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today as our country is in the middle of a war to urge my Republican colleagues to support Senator Murray's proposal that would immediately fund the Department of Homeland Security's critical national security functions, cyber defense, airport safety, the Coast Guard, while negotiations continue on critical reforms on ICE and border control. We must restore accountability. No one knows that better than the people of Minnesota with these agencies, but there's absolutely no reason that we can't do two things at once. And that is fund the bulk of this department while we're working on the reforms to these two agencies, both of which have ample funding. We all saw what happened in Minnesota, where this surge of ICE agents, as local law enforcement in our state made repeatedly clear, it sadly made our state less safe. Two of my constituents were killed, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. In fact, in the month of January, 2 out of 3 of shooting fatalities, 2 out of 3 in the city of Minneapolis were committed by federal agents in the entire month. ICE wrongly arrested a Hmong elder, dragged him out in his underwear as he's trying to show his ID and they wouldn't see it, drove him around in a car in an hour only to discover they had the wrong guy. The guy they were looking for had been in prison for years. They targeted kids. We saw 5-year-old Liam in his blue rabbit hat with floppy ears and a Spider-Man backpack. They stopped a number of off-duty police officers. One of our suburban police chiefs told the story of a police officer where the ICE agents literally took out their guns. Every one of those police officers were people of color, and they repeatedly violated the Constitution and defied court orders. So many people trying to show their IDs, shoved into cars, dropped off 4 blocks later, maybe for the bounties, or taken to the Whipple Center and quickly released. Beyond the human costs, Operation Metro Surge cost taxpayers in Minnesota $18 million a week, and Minnesota's economy $80 million a week, and we are still recovering. But our state stood up together, bringing food, protesting, making sure that people got their kids to school, people bringing strangers' kids to school. And we got an announcement finally of a drawdown to the original footprint. I just talked to Director Homeland about this last week, and he promised to me that they would keep to that plan of the original footprint. They announced some reforms for how those remaining ICE agents and Border Control would do their jobs. But of course, we want to make that permanent. And then last week at the oversight hearing, I pressed Secretary Noem, and what we got through not just my questioning, but my colleagues, including my Republican colleagues, was a refusal to admit her mistakes or take responsibility for her actions. And so her overdue removal from the Department of Homeland Security is also a good step toward accountability. This is a start, and the reason that we want to get these reforms put into law is obvious. We're talking about basic police conduct that you see in red and blue states across our country. That is what we're asking for, those standards of conduct. But as those negotiations continue, what makes the most sense, especially right now, is to make sure that we fund those other agencies. It's not written in law that you can't negotiate on part of a agency, and in this case, ICE, and the activities of these border control agents, that you can't negotiate on that while you are funding the rest of the agency. I would hope that our Republican colleagues would actually welcome that, because that's a way to make sure that we're getting funding and paychecks are getting delivered, while at the same time we're doing these negotiations. And while I did not agree in any way with that major funding increase to ICE, that money could have been used for local police or to pay down the debt, $75 million. But that's what that money went toward. And so they have that money now. So why don't we focus on getting the rest of the agency funded? That's why we put this forward. And that way we could fund disaster relief, cybersecurity, defense, airport security, and the Coast Guard. So when people vote against that to fund those important functions, they are blocking pay for TSA agents who keep us safe. And that is, unfortunately, by not taking this agreement, what we are seeing. Funds for FEMA, Coast Guard, protects our ports and our shorelines. Funding for cybersecurity, which among many things secures our election, protects our information technology. So I asked our colleagues why, instead of just doing this compromise, I think they could have proposed the same thing and we would have definitely supported it. Why would they want so badly to keep ICE with no reforms that they won't fund the rest of this agency? It doesn't make any sense, especially since we are proposing common sense reforms, especially when we are acknowledging, okay, you're not going to agree to it today, but we think it is important to fund the rest of this agency today so we can keep negotiating with you to fund ICE in the future, but only with these reforms. I asked my Senate Republican colleagues to join us in this pragmatic proposal. I urge them to listen to the American people who do want to see reforms to ICE and border control. I think they know that. But the American people also want to fund the important work of FEMA and the Coast Guard and TSA and cybersecurity. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start off by pointing out that New Mexico is home to one of the most important living cultural landscapes in the United States. You may have heard of it. It's known as Chaco Canyon. It's a World Heritage Site and a National Historical Park. It's truly breathtaking if you've ever been there. And when you're there with the immense sky above, you feel like time is converging. Centuries and centuries of history, the bustling lives of farmers and architects, builders, astronomers, and religious leaders from centuries ago, converging with the scurry of nearby wildlife and the hushed murmurs of respectful, awed visitors. And these are all layered onto each other in what for many remains a living, sacred place. It is designated a National Historical Park to tell the stories of the people who lived on this land long before America was even a nation, and those who continue to use these lands to connect to a story bigger than any one person. Every year, millions of Americans and international visitors alike learn parts of our nation's story through the places preserved and stewarded by the National Park System, places like Chaco Canyon. These places tell the story of us, how we became America and how we have grown and changed as a nation. It is a story of triumph, of hardship, of resilience, and sometimes of cruelty. Not every chapter in this story is uplifting, but to understand who you are as Americans and our journey to become what Ronald Reagan rightly called a shining city upon a hill, we have to learn from all of it. We can't erase or turn away from the hard parts, because those parts, and more importantly, how we learned and grew from them, are our shared history, our shared story, and they should never be erased or twisted for politics. But that is just what the Trump administration is trying to do, to censor our history. 1 year ago, President Trump signed an executive order directing federal agencies to review how national park sites portray American history. The executive order required officials to make sure that the Park Service sites did not display content that, quote, inappropriately disparages Americans past or living. As a result of that order, they've already removed some content, and much of it is in the most popular national parks in the American West. In a spreadsheet summarizing the Interior Department's first review last year, Mother Jones found that from 33 sites in the Park Service region that includes my state, 81 submissions had been flagged for review. And of those 81, the department decided that 46 should be altered or removed entirely, over half. But this isn't only happening in the West. Signs related to ecology and the Wabanaki cultural history were completely removed at Acadia National Park. At Stonewall National Monument in New York, mentions of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, pioneering activists central to the 1969 Stonewall Uprising, were scrubbed completely. And this photo, showing what enslaved people experienced at the hands of their enslavers. Let that photo sit with you for just a moment. This photo, which shows how painful our history can be, was ordered to be removed because it is, quote, disparaging of Americans. This is not disparaging, this is truth. This is reality. We cannot be a better nation or a stronger one if we ignore or hide from our own past. We are a great nation because we have learned from our past, especially from our mistakes. We can't do that when we take photos down like this one. And unfortunately, this was just one of the Trump administration's attempts to hollow out our American story. Another came earlier this year when the Department of Interior asked national park staff to spend hundreds of hours reviewing their own exhibits to report signage that might be in violation of the executive order. At Glacier National Park in Montana, mentions of climate change, of course, which is literally melting the very glaciers the park was named after, those were erased. And at Yellowstone, which was established on land from which the U.S. military forcibly removed tribes, any mention of native tribes was ordered to be removed. They're even asking visitors to report any material they find offensive. And Mr. President, I find that offensive. Last June, the Trump administration instructed Park Service staff to post QR codes that visitors can scan to report signs they disagree with. So far, there has been little clarity on the process and, of course, zero public input. But some brave public servants anonymously uploaded the list of reported violations to a public site. Examples from across the country include the entirety of the Emmett Till exhibit in Alabama, reviewing covers of books on the topic of slavery, including autobiographies, reviewing content in Junior Ranger books about emancipation, the cause of the Civil War, freedmen's colonies, because they all might, quote, be disparaging of Americans. So far, the department has reviewed more than 2,000 pieces of media and has ordered the removal or alteration of hundreds of signs and exhibits. And we know they aren't done. So what more could be at risk in the coming days? Well, we have Park Service signs that share Tewa translations. That's a language that has been spoken in our part of the United States since long before the colonies were founded. Because this language is a language other than English, these signs are at risk of removal. Other Park Service signs in New Mexico include Spanish translations, and that should surprise absolutely no one, given our history under Spain and Mexico before being ceded to the United States in 1848. In fact, New Mexico's state constitution recognizes Spanish as a protected language. But because these signs have a language that is not English under the Trump administration, they risk removal. Other exhibits at risk aren't about language. The Trump administration claims it is removing signs because they, quote, cast a negative light on American history. But, Mr. President, this is our history. Someone just doesn't want our history to be told. That is putting the telling of our history at risk. It is, in fact, already under attack. And that is straight out of the authoritarian playbook. It should anger every single American listening today. When we erase information about who we are, when we silence people's stories, we promote a narrative that ignores and manipulates what truly happened. So let me tell you what they are trying to erase. It is true that some of our forefathers founded this country on the enslavement of other human beings. It is true that those human beings built much of this country, including the building we are standing in here today. And we fought a civil war and amended our Constitution and guaranteed rights to millions of Americans as the result of all of that. Because we demanded better of our country and of ourselves. It is true that some of our forefathers forced tribal people from their homes, making them walk hundreds of miles on death marches to resettle in small tracts of land far from the land that they knew. And today, the daily work of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and the Indian Affairs Committee is to protect the rights and advance the well-being of some of those same tribes, because we demanded better and of our nation and of ourselves. It is true that this country did not apply the American values of democracy and justice equally in the beginning, and that women, Black people, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, LGBTQ, and persons with disabilities, just to name a few, all had to struggle to gain the same rights as other groups of people because they demanded better of our nation and for all of us. Like the stories of families that traveled over oceans, like mine did, and traveled over mountains to be part of the American dream, the story of those fights are the stories of how America became the country that it is and how we will continue to lead. The hardships, the pain, the suffering, they aren't false and they aren't fictions. They made us stronger. And they don't negate the progress that we've made or the pride that we take in our country as we continue to strive for a more perfect union. Because every good story is rooted in place. I often say that public lands are the anvil on which our collective American identity was forged. Because these lands preserve where much of that history happened. These lands, from our historical parks, our historic trails, to our national parks and monuments and wilderness areas, these lands hold the echoes of our ancestors. They hold the good and the bad. And knowing the truth makes us better, makes us stronger. That's what makes us demand more for our country, more for ourselves. New Mexico tells us this. Take the story of the Manhattan Project in my home state. You know, we now have a National Historic Park to tell that story. But you can't tell that story of the dawn of the atomic age without telling the whole story, without recognizing the people from our New Mexico communities whose health was sacrificed to build those powerful devices. You can't hold up the amazing scientific advances made under J. Robert Oppenheimer's supervision without also telling the story of his political persecution and the removal of his clearance. You know, George Orwell predicted a lot of things, and he once wrote, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." Right now, President Trump is dumbing down our history. He is cheapening our national parks. But he will not take our history from us. We will tell these stories again and again and again, as long as it takes, and long after he is relegated to the history books. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll go ahead and end this stream. I want to thank everybody that was in attendance. But before I do, let me just say this. You know, I live here in Charleston, South Carolina, and I hear all the different things that the Trump administration is trying to erase as far as history is concerned. But if you're in Charleston, South Carolina, and you go down the road called Highway 61, and if you're a black man, if you're a brown man, if you're a young, that highway reminds you of how your ancestors at one point in time lived. Because all along Highway 61, there's nothing but plantation. Magnolia Plantation, Ashley Hall Plantation, Boone Hall Plantation, Drayton Hall Plantation. All those things that they here in South Carolina, they take our school children to and say this is a part of history. Or if they go down to the old slave market in Charleston, South Carolina, say this is a part of history. It's funny. As long as the United States government or a particular state is making money off something, they don't want to erase it. You can't make money off a picture of a man that was beaten within an inch of his life. You can't take a picture and say this is how America is. But we can have living, breathing examples of who and what America was at one time. Drayton Hall Plantation, Boone Hall Plantation. I guarantee you, if you live in the South, somewhere close to you in your vicinity, there's a plantation. But they want us as black people to forget that when we drive by it every day. They want to tell us that Charlestown Landing is this perfect place. The first place the Pilgrims set foot here. Plymouth Rock and all that other stuff. But they don't want to tell us of what they did once they got here. They don't want to tell us about the smallpox. They don't want to tell us about the Trail of Tears and all this other stuff once the Europeans got a foothold in this side of the world. They don't want to tell us about the atrocities because it might hurt some of their feelings. But truth is truth. And as I said earlier, those that refuse to adhere to history is doomed to repeat it. And tell me that the Trump administration is not trying to take us back to a time to where there's certain people, a certain ethnic group of people are systematically being erased or taken away out of this country. You call it what you want, but I call it ethnic cleansing. We saw this before. They called the Aryans, remember? But that, ladies and gentlemen, y'all thank you very much. I gotta go. But I'll be back a little bit later on this evening with some YouTube fuckery. So y'all hang around for that there. We're gonna finish part 2 of talking about Anton Daniels. Y'all have a great day. Be safe. Watch your 3, your 6, and your 9. We out here.
I don't trust people anymore, not because I hate them, but because every single fucking hand I held eventually dropped me. I showed up when it was uncomfortable, when it was heavy, when nobody else wanted the responsibility. I stayed loyal, stayed patient, stayed silent, and still got left like my effort never mattered. People love you when you're useful, but the second you need them, they vanish without explanation. Look at me, that shit changes you, because you realize trust isn't rare, consistency is. I didn't become guarded for no reason. I became guarded after being dropped too many fucking times. Every promise that broke, every silence that followed taught me exactly how people really move. So if I don't trust people anymore, understand, this isn't bitterness, it's survival.